Russia has always stated that the Southern Kuril Islands became part of the USSR as a result of World War II, and Russian sovereignty over them, which has a corresponding international legal formalization, is not subject to doubt. However, the Russian side recognizes the Joint Declaration of 1956 as a document ratified by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Japan claims all the islands and links the decision to recognize Japanese sovereignty over these territories with the signing of a peace treaty. On September 12, 2018, Russian President Vladimir Putin made a proposal to sign a peace treaty with Japan by the end of the year without preconditions. This document has been discussed since the end of World War II. The main obstacle to an agreement is the dispute over several islands in the southern part of the Kuril archipelago, Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and several small uninhabited islands of the Lesser Kuril Ridge, all in the Sakhalin region. In Japan they are called Northern Territories. The Kuril archipelago is a chain of islands between Kamchatka and Hokkaido Island. They were originally inhabited by the Ainu tribes. The first information about the Kuril Islands was obtained by the Japanese during an expedition of 1635 to 1637. In 1643 the Dutch led by Martin de Vries explored the islands. The first Russian expedition reached the northern part of the ridge in 1697. In 1786, by a decree of Catherine the Great, the Kuril archipelago was incorporated into the Russian Empire. On February 7, 1855 Japan and Russia signed the Treaty of Shimoda, which placed Iturup, Kunashir, and the islands of the Lesser Kuril Ridge under Japanese control, while the northern part of the Kuril Islands remained under Russian control. Sakhalin was declared a joint ownership, undivided territory. However, the dual power in Sakhalin led to conflicts between Russian and Japanese merchants and sailors. The contradictions between the parties were resolved in 1875 with the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg on the exchange of territories. Under this treaty, Russia gave Japan all of the Kuril Islands, and Japan renounced its claims to Sakhalin. On September 5, 1905, as a result of Russian-Japanese War, Portsmouth Peace Treaty was signed, according to which Japan received a portion of Sakhalin south of the 50th parallel. The legacy of World War II. At the Yalta Conference, at the conclusion of the war in Europe, the leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition formulated a joint plan of war with Japan. At the same time it was decided that after the defeat of the Imperial Army, all of the islands in the Kuril Ridge would fall to the Soviet Union. On August 9, 1945 the Soviet Army began a military campaign in the Far East. It included a landing operation in the Kuril Islands, as a result of which all islands were liberated. After the defeat in the war, Japan signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender and accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945. Japanese sovereignty was limited to the islands of Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku and Hokkaido, as well as the smaller islands of the Japanese archipelago, as decided by the Allies. All the Kuril Islands were included in the Soviet Union by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Within 3 years, most of the Japanese population was deported to Hokkaido. During the Cold War, Moscow did not officially recognize the existence of the territorial problem, while Tokyo adhered to the principle of political and economic inseparability, which meant that Japan would not engage in large-scale trade and economic cooperation with the USSR until it obtained concessions in the dispute over the islands. The Soviet side acknowledged the territorial problem in April 1991, during an official visit to Japan by Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. During Russian President Boris Yeltsin's visit to Japan, the existence of the problem was confirmed in the Tokyo Declaration on Russian-Japanese Relations. It said the sides held talks on the issue of ownership of the islands of Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan and Habamai, and agreed to continue negotiations in order to conclude a peace treaty as soon as possible, on the basis of historical and legal facts, and on established bilateral documents and the principles of legality and justice. In November 1997, Boris Yeltsin and Prime Minister Ryutaro Hashimoto agreed to make every effort to conclude a peace treaty between Russia and Japan by 2000. In January 1998, a peace treaty commission led by the foreign ministers of both countries was established. Boris Yeltsin outlined his vision of a solution to the Kuril question during a visit to Moscow by Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi. He suggested creating conditions for joint economic and other activities in the Southern Kuril Islands without compromising the legal positions of both sides. At the same time, the Russian side called for a separate agreement on the territorial issue after signing a bilateral treaty on peace, friendship and cooperation. In the Moscow Declaration on Establishing a Creative Partnership between the Russian Federation and Japan, adopted at the end of the visit, the sides reaffirmed their determination to make every effort to conclude a peace treaty by the year 2000. Attempts to resolve the issue since the early 2000s. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Japanese Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori signed a joint statement on a peace treaty in Tokyo. It expressed the intention to resolve the issue of ownership of the islands of Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan and Habamai on the basis of all agreements reached, including the Tokyo and Moscow declarations. The desire of the sides to accelerate the negotiation process and conclude a peace treaty was reiterated in the Irkutsk statement issued on March 25, 2001, following talks between Vladimir Putin and Yoshiro Mori. On January 10, 2003, during the visit of Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi to the Russian Federation, a joint statement was signed in which the parties reaffirmed their determination to conclude a peace treaty as soon as possible through vigorous negotiations. On April 29, 2013, at talks in Moscow, Vladimir Putin and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe adopted a joint statement in which the parties agreed that the situation in which, 67 years after the end of World War II, Russia and Japan have not concluded a peace treaty is not normal. 2 rounds of consultations on the peace treaty took place in Moscow and Tokyo. Details of the ongoing negotiations were not disclosed. However, on May 9, 2014, the Japanese government suspended consultations due to the situation in Ukraine. In March 2012, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin said that an acceptable compromise must be reached on the territorial issue. In May 2016, Vladimir Putin and Shinzo Abe agreed on a new approach to solving bilateral problems. Russia has always claimed that the Southern Kuril Islands were part of the USSR as a result of World War II, and Russian sovereignty over them, which has the appropriate international legal framework, is not in question. However, the Russian side recognizes the Joint Declaration of 1956 as a document ratified by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Japan claims all the islands and links the decision to recognize Japanese sovereignty over these territories with the signing of a peace treaty.